What happens when one of the world's fastest-growing economies suddenly finds itself exposed to a war thousands of kilometers away? India's economic story over the past year had been almost textbook perfect: strong growth, cooling inflation, stable external balances, the kind of rare equilibrium economists describe as a Goldilocks phase. But that balance is now under serious threat. The escalating conflict in the Middle East involving the United States, Israel, and Iran has begun to ripple through India's economic system in ways that are both immediate and structural. The benchmark Sensex has already dropped sharply, losing over 9% since the conflict began. Investor confidence is wavering, and policymakers are being forced into rapid responses. At the center of this disruption lies a simple reality. India is deeply connected to the Middle East, not just for oil, but for trade, remittances, and financial flows. As the crisis intensifies, India is discovering that geopolitical shocks do not remain confined to battlefields. They travel through energy routes, capital markets, and currency systems, reshaping economic trajectories far beyond their point of origin. What initially appears as a distant conflict quickly becomes a domestic economic challenge. For months, India's economy had been operating in what analysts called a Goldilocks zone. Growth was high, inflation was easing, and macroeconomic stability appeared within reach. The government projected GDP growth between 7.0% and 7.4% for the coming fiscal year, positioning India as one of the strongest performers among major economies. But the latest assessment from the Ministry of Finance India warns that this phase is now under strain. The report describes multi-layered risks emerging from the Middle East conflict, suggesting that the current environment could significantly derail growth momentum. Independent agencies have already begun revising their forecasts downward, with some estimates falling closer to 6.5% if the conflict persists. The concern is not just about slower growth, but about the simultaneous emergence of multiple pressures, something economists often describe as a triple shock. When growth slows, inflation rises, and the currency weakens all at once, policymakers face limited room to maneuver. This is precisely the situation India now risks entering, with each of these pressures reinforcing the others in a complex feedback loop that could amplify economic instability if not managed carefully. The first major pressure point is energy. India imports nearly 90% of its crude oil, making it highly vulnerable to disruptions in global supply. Around 40% of those imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but critical waterway that has become the epicenter of the current crisis. When tensions escalated and Iran disrupted shipping routes, oil prices surged sharply, acting like an immediate tax on the Indian economy. Higher crude prices translate directly into increased costs for transportation, manufacturing, and household consumption. At the same time, logistical disruptions have created what officials describe as a double squeeze: reduced inflows of crude oil and difficulties in exporting refined products. Infrastructure damage in key energy-producing regions, including temporary halts by major players like QatarEnergy, has compounded the problem. Even if the conflict subsides, restarting production and normalizing supply chains will take time. For India, this means prolonged exposure to elevated energy costs, which could continue to weigh on economic performance well beyond the immediate crisis and delay recovery timelines. The second pressure point is inflation, which is already beginning to rise as a result of these energy shocks. Data from S&P Global indicates that input prices for Indian manufacturers reached a 4-year high in March 2026, driven largely by higher fuel and logistics costs. This type of cost-push inflation is particularly challenging because it originates from supply constraints rather than demand pressures. As businesses face higher input costs, they are forced to pass those costs on to consumers, leading to rising prices across the economy. For households, the impact is immediate: higher fuel prices, increased transportation costs, and even shortages of essential items like cooking gas in some regions. The government now faces a difficult choice: increase subsidies to shield consumers, which would strain the fiscal deficit, or allow prices to rise, which would fuel inflation and potentially slow consumption. Either option carries risks. Inflation erodes purchasing power, particularly for lower-income households, while higher fiscal spending can undermine long-term economic stability and complicate fiscal discipline targets. The third major challenge lies in the external sector, particularly the pressure on India's currency and financial markets. The Indian rupee has weakened significantly, approaching record lows against the US dollar as capital flows reverse direction. In March alone, foreign institutional investors pulled out approximately $12.5 billion from Indian markets, reflecting a broader risk-off sentiment among global investors. As capital exits, the currency weakens further, making imports, especially oil, even more expensive. This dynamic also contributes to a widening current account deficit, which is expected to increase from its current level as the cost of energy imports rises and export growth slows. In response, the Reserve Bank of India has taken the unusual step of imposing limits on open foreign exchange positions involving the rupee, capping exposure for dealers in an effort to reduce volatility. While such measures can provide short-term stability, they also highlight the severity of the pressures facing the currency. Economists suggest that if the rupee continues to weaken, the central bank may be forced to consider interest rate hikes, despite the potential impact on growth and investment activity. Beyond these immediate pressures, the broader implications for India's economy are deeply interconnected with global geopolitics. Trade routes through the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz are critical not only for energy, but also for India's exports to Europe and the United States. Any prolonged disruption could affect supply chains, increase freight costs, and reduce competitiveness in international markets. At the same time, the Middle East remains a vital source of remittances for India, with millions of Indian workers employed across Gulf countries. Instability in the region could disrupt these flows, reducing a key source of foreign exchange and household income for many families. Domestically, the economy is already showing signs of uneven demand, with strong urban consumption contrasting with weaker rural spending. A normal monsoon may help stabilize food prices and revive rural demand, but it cannot offset the structural pressures coming from external shocks. In many ways, India's current situation illustrates the vulnerabilities of a globally integrated economy. Strong fundamentals can provide resilience, but they cannot fully insulate a country from geopolitical turbulence. As the Middle East conflict continues to evolve, India's economic trajectory will depend not only on domestic policy responses, but also on how quickly stability can be restored to one of the world's most critical regions, and whether global markets regain confidence in the durability of supply chains and financial flows.